So thank you very much for joining. And I say what we're going to be talking about today is kind of trying to understand where biology kind of meets sci-fi and see if there is kind of any truth to whether an infection can cause something that we might recognize as a zombie. Um, We'll talk about some examples of infections that kind of come very close to what we might identify as a kind of a zombie from like a film like 28 Days Later or something like that. And we'll see maybe some examples of diseases you might not have heard of, but we'll see how they can also kind of try and tick some of the boxes of things that we could recognize as something that would cause a zombie. I suppose one of the first kind of questions that we have to ask when we're considering the science of the zombie is it really realistic to think of a situation in which a infection can change our behavior and kind of turn somebody into a mindless killing machine? Most zombie films, most zombie kind of TVs of things like Walking Dead, even things like The Last of Us. All of these deal with a infection, be it a virus or a fungus, getting into people and changing how they behave. Now, different zombie media kind of address the issue a bit differently. So in some, zombies are literally the undead. People die and then come back as a zombie. Others, like 28 Days Later and The Last of Us, they deal with it a bit different in that the people aren't necessarily dead or undead, as the case may be. It's just that an infection has kind of changed how they behave. One of the things that I'm going to be kind of saying, and I'll say it now to get it out of the way, is that as far as we know, and I'll always say it like that in case somebody comes back in a few years and proves me wrong, as far as we know, there is no infectious disease, be it virus, bacteria, or fungus, that can create an undead zombie. Once somebody is dead, there's nothing, no pathogen that can bring that kind of corpse back in the same way as that, like I said, something like 28 Days Later or, again, the Romero films would have you believe. So from that perspective, zombies aren't real. But rather than kind of finishing the lecture at this point, because it would be a very, very short lecture otherwise, what's really, really interesting is kind of seeing where different media, where different kind of zombie films, zombie literature have actually taken real ideas from biology and actually kind of exaggerated them for dramatic effect. So things will happen to a person that will change their behavior to such an extent that they are behaving in ways that are completely unrecognizable to everybody who knew that person before. So from the perspective of what are some of these behaviors that, if you enjoy a bit of kind of, say, Walking Dead or something like that, Resident Evil, you'll know that some of these archetypes of what makes a zombie a zombie. They tend to be aggressive, not necessarily aggressive to other zombies, but certainly aggressive to the living or animals, anything that isn't part of their kind of little group. This aggression will be a result of usually a loss of reason, that for whatever reason their brain has stopped functioning and they're just being driven by almost animal instincts to kind of to feed and to kind of try and kind of look after themselves. This is why in many kind of the zombie media that we consume, it's fairly easy to trick a zombie. You cover yourself in their blood or whatever, and they'll just think that you are one of them. So aggression, loss of reason. The other kind of classic archetype is zombies, and again, depending on which kind of type of zombie media you like to consume, zombies are either slow and shambling, or they can be very, very fast. Me personally, for my money, if there was going to be a zombie apocalypse tomorrow, I would hope and pray that they would be slow zombies. But regardless of kind of what type, all both of these have in common is that their movement has been dramatically altered by the pathogen which has infected them. Zombie media tends to identify the spread of the zombie plague with being bitten by a zombie. And believe it or not, real life scientists have actually done some research to see if a zombie outbreak were to happen kind of tomorrow, would the human race be able to survive? And unfortunately, if we kind of assume that they're a traditional zombie where things spread by bites, it's actually quite bad news for the human race. And when we kind of put all these things into our simulators, we tend to get extinct within a few months. Because a zombie by biting will then create another zombie. Each zombie might infect dozens of other people. So what we see very quickly in all the simulations that we do is the zombie plague would spread kind of exponentially until at the end there would be no humans left. The change in their behavior will often kind of result in kind of identifiable changes in attitude, in their identity, even before they become fully undead. They might not be able to recognize people, they might not feel well. But again, it's kind of interesting that when we look in a moment about some of the kind of the real biology behind zombies, as it were, that all of these things, apart from the undead, which, as I say, at the moment isn't quite possible, things like aggression, viruses, bacteria that cause aggression, that cause loss of reason, that are spread by bites, aren't particularly uncommon. And we'll talk about an example of one of these in a moment. But the kind of interesting question is, why would a disease, whatever kind of type of disease it is, why would it cause these changes in behavior? Why would we suddenly change our kind of attitudes? Why would we suddenly become aggressive? Why would we suddenly kind of crave the taste of brains? Well, the reason is our behavior is fundamentally kind of decided by our biology. So our attitudes, our approach to life, kind of our ability to empathize and to kind of communicate with our fellow people is all driven by the biology within our brain. And whilst we might think as individuals that our personalities are fairly fixed, we are who we are and nothing will change that, the reality is our brain is very, very susceptible to factors that will cause it to change and therefore change our behavior. Classic case in point, I am a fairly chill, laid-back person. My colleagues in the room may start laughing at this, but I promise you I am. But if I've not eaten in quite a long period of time, I will get quite annoying to be around. I will get pedantic, my temper will get short. I will, in essence, become very, very hangry. And this is something that many of you in the audience may experience. Or you might start getting kind of angry if you're feeling tired. This is because the wider goings on in your body are directly influencing how your brain is functioning. And as a result of influencing how your brain is functioning, it is literally going to be changing your behavior. So the notion that something can kind of come from the outside and change your behavior isn't quite as alien or as science fiction as it might first appear. And indeed, if we kind of skip ahead a slide to talk about this from an infection perspective, it's really, really kind of well known that infections can change our behavior. Now, if you've ever had the cold or the flu, you may have actually experienced some of these changes yourself. So, for example, you might feel kind of constantly tired, that you want to be sleeping all of the time if you've got a really bad cold. You may have no appetite, no desire to eat, kind of no desire to drink. You just want to kind of lay in bed and kind of feel ill and feel sorry for yourself. This change in your behavior is actually a direct consequence of you being infected with that particular virus. And how these viruses, like coughs and colds and all those type of things, are able to influence your behavior, we can see that there's quite a lot of different mechanisms. So, for example, one of these is that some pathogens, and we'll talk about one of these in a moment, are actually able to directly infect your brain. And by infecting your brain, they will change how it behaves and how it functions, and that can have significant impact on your behavior. Another type of way that, and again, thinking about things like colds and flu, one of the ways that these viruses, that these infections are able to change our behavior is through a process that's known as inflammation. Now, inflammation is the process the body uses to try and protect itself from infections. It will do things like cause more white blood cells to go to the site of the infection to try and fight off whatever pathogen is causing you harm. But in the process, it will try and do other things as well to protect the body from the infection. So I mentioned that if you've had a bad cold, you might have no appetite, or your sleep might be disturbed. This occurs as a result of some of the chemicals that are released during inflammation to try and protect your body from the particular pathogen. And it's not just our body that secretes things in response to an infection. Sometimes the pathogen itself can release compounds that will change how we behave. Again, we'll talk about one example of this in a moment. And often the reason that these pathogens secrete these toxins is to try and make it easier for them to keep the infection going, be it either to cause it, to make it easier for it to spread within the body or to spread within the kind of the population. Again, if you've ever had a cold, you might realize you sneeze a lot, whereas normally you wouldn't sneeze at all. That again is the virus subtly changing your behavior and the things that your body does to make it able to spread easier. Delirium, fever, stress, or, again, if you've ever kind of had, I know a few years ago I had COVID and quite unwell with it, and I was kind of hot, cold, seeing things, hearing things that weren't there. And it was all because my body was kind of trying to fight off this infection. And through the process of inflammation, was producing so many different chemicals to fight off that particular virus. It was causing havoc in my brain. Now, again, this is all about kind of behavior. I mentioned in that previous slide that kind of one of the classic things that makes a zombie is that they have altered movement. And again, if you can think back to, again, if you've ever had a particularly bad kind of dose of the flu or something like that, you might be in agony, that your joints hurt, that your muscle hurts. And rather than being able to kind of walk or move kind of confidently and with purpose, you'll find that you're kind of shuffling along or kind of even unable to move at all. And again, this is because that infection and the body's response to that infection is actually changing how your body is able to regulate itself and able to control itself. So just before we kind of move on to start looking at some real kind of examples of infections that come close to what we would understand as a zombie infection. This slide is just here to say that kind of infections changing how we move and infections changing how we behave isn't that far beyond the realms of possibility, because it will happen almost every time that you have a bad cold, flu, tonsillitis, or anything like that. So an infection changing how we move and changing how we behave isn't the most unrealistic thing that we see in zombie media. So what are some of the real life diseases that we might be able to kind of interpret within the realm of a disease that causes zombies, or at least Hollywood would take as an inspiration for causing zombies? Probably the classic example of such a disease is rabies. Now, rabies is a viral infection of the nervous system. It's caused by a virus that belongs to a group of viruses called the Lissa viruses. And it isn't particularly common in the UK because we've been rather effective at eradicating it from its normal reservoir, so where the virus normally lives. Because the thing with rabies is it normally lives in animals, particularly mammals, dogs, bats, raccoons, and so on and so forth. And what we've been able to do in the UK is eradicate it from that particular reservoir. That's why we have such strict controls over bringing live animals into this country. Because the problem you have with rabies is if an infected animal bites you, then the rabies virus will essentially be transmitted through saliva from the infected animal into the person that has been bitten. And what we'll then see is the virus will replicate in the area near the bite, but then it will move into the nervous system. It will first start to infect the nerves close to the bite, and it will then move up through the nerves until it reaches our central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord. Now, how long it takes rabies to progress to the central nervous system can vary significantly from patient to patient. In some cases, it will be several weeks. In other cases, it will be months. Generally speaking, if you get bitten on the foot, it will take longer than if you were bitten on the neck. And as soon as rabies reaches the central nervous system, it causes swelling within the brain. So something that we would call encephalitis. And as soon as the rabies has kind of got to the brain and causes encephalitis, we start to see some of the classic symptoms that we associate with rabies. And these are the symptoms which are kind of the inspiration of many a zombie story. Because these symptoms can include things like fever, hallucinations, confusion, muscle spasms, so people can move in quite a jerky way, pain, tingling, altered sensation. Perhaps kind of one of the classical symptoms of rabies is what we would call hydrophobia. So it's often described as patients become afraid of water. And this isn't fear in the kind of the psychological sense, but rather it's when a patient with rabies drinks water, it generates very, very painful muscle spasms in their throat. So patients avoid water, not necessarily because they're psychologically afraid of it, but rather they don't want the pain. So we have a virus that spreads through biting, and that will change the behavior of the patients who are bitten very, very significantly. And what we see with rabies is it can come in one of two distinct kind of types. Paralytic rabies, which is where patients have much reduced movement, the weakness and paralysis is very common. But there is also something called furious rabies, where patients tend to be a lot more hyperactive, agitated, and again, very, very uncomfortable in themselves. Now, unfortunately, when rabies reaches this point, it is most universally fatal. Once patients become symptomatic with rabies, there's nothing that can be done. So, and this again is kind of the theme in many zombie media, that once the person is infected and symptomatic, there's nothing that we can do. But the interesting thing with rabies is if the patient seeks medical health after being bitten, but before the symptoms demonstrate, we can actually do quite a lot to help these patients. Because what we will do is something called post-exposure prophylaxis, in which essentially we will inject the patient with a vaccine against the rabies virus. And what this will do is it will train the body to recognize the rabies virus and to destroy it before it's able to reach the central nervous system. So very, very different to your kind of traditional zombies where nothing can be done. Rabies is treatable if caught before the symptoms manifest. And this is why it's so important that if people are bitten by animals in countries where rabies is endemic, it's really, really important that you seek medical help. Again, say many kind of zombie media kind of have taken their inspiration from rabies, 28 days later and so on. Whilst that virus was called the rage virus in that film, it has a lot of kind of characteristics that were very, very similar to rabies. Infected people become very aggressive. They spread the infection through blood and saliva. They attack. The big difference between rabies and the rage virus is, as I said, rabies can take months before patients become symptomatic, whereas the virus in 28 days later and all its sequels occur almost instantly. So again, you can see where they've drawn the inspiration, but the reality is, unfortunately, a bit different. But I say, when we have a look at the role of rabies as a kind of attempt to kind of rationalize or explain zombies and how they could exist in the real life, I say there are some interesting kind of parallels that we can draw. So, for example, it affects the nervous system, spreads through bites, affects the brain. Say once symptoms start, it's usually fatal. And again, something else to kind of consider, that, when you're watching, again, Shaun of the Dead and so on, people know that once they are bitten, that the end is inevitable. And that must generate a significant kind of degree of anxiety and fear within those individuals. Same has to be said for patients who've been exposed to rabies. Particularly if they're living in areas where the rabies vaccine isn't available, that essentially they are just waiting for symptoms to start, and they know once those symptoms have started, then unfortunately there's very little that can be done. Now, I said kind of rabies is the kind of the archetype virus that many kind of producers and directors will use to kind of rush to kind of explain their zombie virus. But there are other infections which more closely resemble the kind of the classical zombie. Again, an infection that will come and that will change the organism's behavior with kind of catastrophic effects. Now, the important thing to kind of note at this point is that this particular infection isn't one that necessarily infects humans, but rather it's something that infects ants. So there is a fungus that's kind of referred to as the zombie ant fungus. Its real name is Ophiocordyceps unilaterris. And if you have either played The Last of Us on PlayStation or you've watched The Last of Us on telly, the name cordyceps will be very, very familiar to you, because it is this particular virus that the writers of The Last of Us actually used as their influence when writing the game. Indeed, if I remember correctly, they actually got the inspiration for their game whilst watching the Planet Earth documentary on the BBC. And they could see how this fungus infecting these ants, completely kind of changing their behavior, might actually be a really interesting kind of place to take the zombie genre. So, what is this fungus and what does it do? Well, fungi are things that are fairly kind of ubiquitous and common in nature. If you eat mushrooms, you eat fungi. And fungi are able to spread by producing and kind of releasing spores into the air, into water, into soil, whatever. And this particular fungus, so Ophiocordyceps, it will release its spores, and these spores will land on the shell of ants like the carpenter ants. And these usually live in the rainforest along the kind of tropics. And what will happen is, as soon as that spore lands on the ant, the spore will start to germinate, and it will produce these thin rope-like structures called hyphae. And these hyphae will actually penetrate the exoskeleton of the ant and get into the inside of the ant. And as soon as that hyphae is inside the body of the ant, it will then spread effectively throughout the ant's body. Now, this is already grim enough, but what happens next kind of takes this to a whole new level, in that the ant will then actually, once it's infected and the fungal spores are kind of through it, it will actually leave its nest and will climb up trees, for example, places where they wouldn't kind of normally be found. And they'll get onto kind of into the canopy, and they'll find a leaf, and they will then bite onto the leaf in order to kind of fix themselves in position, something they call the death grip. And what's happened here is essentially the fungus has taken control effectively of the ant and made it move to a region that's more suited for the fungus to be able to grow and spread. So it'll go high up where it's warm and humid, the spores will be released, and a new cycle of infection will start. This fungus will eat the ant from the inside out. Like I said, it will basically cause it to go into a region where it wouldn't normally be found. It literally kind of takes control almost of the whole ant and turns it into a vessel for the spread of that fungus. And we've actually come quite close to figuring out how this fungus is able to do this, because we believe that the fungus actually goes into the ant's brain and changes the chemistry within the brain of the ant, causing it to behave very, very abnormally. Now, the good news is this particular fungus is very, very specifically adapted to ants. So the chances of this particular fungus jumping from ants to humans is very, very slight, because human bodies are very, very different to ants. And actually, if you've watched the Last of Us program, in the beginning of one of the episodes, there's like an interview being taken back between a scientist and a TV crew, kind of explaining why fungal infections of humans are quite difficult and quite challenging. And it's actually quite an interesting part of the program, because it's based in good science. And one of the points they make, and one of the points that's actually true, is one of the big kind of differences between us and ants, for example, is our body temperature is much, much higher. And these fungi really, really don't like that. Indeed, when we have a look generally at the type of infections that cause disease in humans, viruses and bacteria are very, very common causes of disease. Fungi, not that significant. This is because fungi grow very, very slowly and often require very specific conditions to grow. And so outside of things like athlete's foot and so on, rarely do we see significant infectious disease burden caused by fungi in humans. So good news is the chances of this particular cordyceps transforming into something like we saw in The Last of Us is thankfully very, very minimal. Because again, say it's something that directly inspired that particular video game, but it is thankfully at the moment a work of fiction. Now, from the perspective of, again, some of these kind of organisms which kind of change behavior, we've talked about a virus in the form of rabies and how that kind of mimics some of the signs and symptoms of a zombie infection. We've talked about cordyceps and the case of the zombie ants, and kind of how a fungus is able to kind of cause this type of change in behavior to the detriment of the animal that has been infected. There are also other types of organism that are able to cause this type of behavior within individuals. And I was talking with Hinos before we started, when I kind of put this lecture together. In the beginning, it was filled with gruesome, horrifying pictures of people being eaten alive by zombies and so on. And then I thought, no, it's a tea time lecture, so probably best kind of judge the pictures a bit more sensibly. But there was one picture that I had to kind of keep included. And I say I'll put a warning note up here that the next slide contains a scary image, and that you are very welcome to kind of avert your eyes or to close the laptop monitor or whatever. Because the picture I'm going to be showing you next is an example of a creature that can spread an infection amongst people and other mammals that can actually significantly change the behavior of the individuals in a way that we might kind of understand through the lens of zombies. So, forewarned, I'm going to be bringing up the picture now, and this is the scary picture. This handsome gentleman is George, and he is my cat. And you might be thinking, has he completely lost the plot? Answer probably is yes, a little bit. But why do I have the picture of a cat up on a lecture about zombies? Well, actually, the reason why I have a picture of a cat on a lecture about zombies is cats are known to carry and transmit a pathogen that is called Toxoplasma gondii. Now, Toxoplasma gondii is often referred to as a mind control parasite. That's what you'll often hear it called in the media. And Toxoplasma is an example of what we would call a single cell parasite. So it isn't a fungus, it isn't a virus, and it isn't a bacteria. Rather, it's a relatively kind of complete organism that infects other organisms much the same way as other infectious disease. Other examples of these single-celled parasites can include things like malaria, for example. Now, what is toxoplasma, and kind of why are cats part of this story? Well, what we see with many parasites like Toxoplasma is they have a very complicated life cycle. And these life cycles often require several different kind of stages or vectors to transmit the developing parasite from one animal to the next. Now, in the case of Toxoplasma, the definitive host is the cat, the domesticated cat, and probably wild cats as well. And what this means is that the parasite is where the cat is where the parasite is able to reproduce, carry out sexual reproduction, and to produce the next generation of parasites. These cats will shed the parasite in the form of eggs called oocysts within their feces. And it has to be said, these oocysts are very, very hardy. They can survive all kinds of different conditions. And what will then happen in nature is mice and rats would come into contact with these oocysts and eat them. Now, if you've ever seen Tom and Jerry, the cartoon, which is very, very, I've been told, very scientifically accurate in depicting the relationship between mice and cats, you will know that rodents, generally speaking, are very averse to felines. They will avoid cats for good reason. Cats like eating mice. But once the mice are infected with the toxoplasma will actually work to reduce the natural fear response that mice have of cats. So what this will mean effectively is mice, if they see a cat, they would be less likely to run away. Indeed, they might even kind of walk up to the cat. This, of course, means the cat will then eat the mice. The developing parasite within the mouse will then be able to go back into the cat, where it will complete its maturation and its development, and then the next cycle of infections can start. Now, its role in changing the behavior of rodents is very, very well documented. There's loads of science that's been done on it. What's really interesting is there has been some research which suggests that toxoplasma can actually change human behavior as well. Now, bits of this is quite controversial, but because we're talking about zombies, let's kind of lump these in there, because there's a lot of kind of suggestion being done that when people become infected with toxoplasma, it can actually do things like change our reaction times, even make us more willing to take risks. So there's a suggestion that people who are infected with toxoplasma may actually be engaging in more risky behavior, which of course is what the parasite is doing to the mice and the rats. It's making them participate in more risky behavior, with the hope that they will then get eaten by the cats. Obviously, we don't get eaten by cats quite so much. So there isn't that kind of driver for the parasite, but it's just inside a mammal, so it's doing what it does. So of course, the question is kind of, well, how do humans, oh, crikey, sorry, I clicked on the wrong button there. So kind of how do humans become infected with the toxoplasma? Well, essentially, if you have a cat, you will know that you have to clean their litter tray every now and again. And in doing so, if you're not washing your hands properly, you can become exposed to the oocysts. And then if you touch your mouth, the eggs will get into you and will start growing. It's even possible that, if you're growing fruit and veg in your back garden, a cat might have come along, defecated on your prized gooseberries, and while you then are eating the fruit, you would kind of inadvertently eating these parasites as well. That's why it's really, really important that you clean any fruit and veg that you are eating. And if you're eating meat, that you also cook the meat properly. Because again, these uncooked meat is a vector by which these particular parasites are able to spread. Now, another way in which toxoplasma can spread in humans is actually during childbirth. So if a mother has been infected and is then delivering the baby, what can actually happen is the level of toxoplasma in the mother's body will be so high, it can actually be transferred across to the baby through kind of small tears and bleeds in the birth canal as the baby is being born. Now, before everybody who has a cat gets really worried that their cat is releasing mind control parasites, although that would explain the massive bill for dreamies and catnip that I seem to be building up at the moment, that George has magic powers of mind control. It is important to say that the kind of amount that this particular parasite is able to change our human behavior is perhaps kind of not to the extent that it will change the behavior of mice, not to the extent that cordyceps will change the behavior of an ant, nor certainly not to the extent that rabies will change our behavior when we are infected. I say, it's just an example of how infectious parasites, in this case, can actually manipulate behaviors of different hosts. So again, not causing zombies in the classical sense, but rather changing our behavior from our baseline. Again, there's all sorts of links with toxoplasma being made into conditions like things like Alzheimer's and so on as well. So it really is a infection that we are starting to kind of spend a lot more time researching, because it does seem to have all these interesting links to lots of different other conditions. So this is just kind of a reflection. So when we were talking about rabies earlier, I mentioned kind of encephalitis. I say encephalitis is something that can be caused by lots of different infections, not just rabies. I say any infection that gets into the brain can cause inflammation or swelling within the brain. And this will fundamentally change our behavior. Again, it's this reflection that who we are as a person is, yes, partly psychological, but that psychology is driven by our biology. And particularly within the central nervous system, the biology within our brain is very, very tightly controlled. Any small minor deviations from the normal within the brain can cause some quite significant changes, particularly kind of when it comes to things like our behavior. So, could a real zombie outbreak happen? Unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your persuasion, not like they show in the movies, particularly if you're talking about something that raises people from the dead. That just kind of thing doesn't exist, nor are there any kind of realistic mechanisms by which that we could explain something. So, like, for example, in the Walking Dead franchise, the virus, the wildfire virus, is something that had spread globally. It's infected everyone alive on Earth somehow. And then once they're infected, they become asymptomatic. So nobody knows they have it until they die. And then, however they die, the virus suddenly wakes up again and turns them into zombies. Again, there is no mechanism that we are aware of in medical science that will cause this type of reanimation to occur. One of the things that they kind of make out in The Walking Dead, for example, is that the zombies are often kind of driven by activity within regions of the brain like the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is a region of our brain which is responsible and kind of crucial for kind of processing emotions, and particularly things like fear, kind of driving kind of things like our memory formation as well. It plays a big role as well in the fight or flight response. So again, deciding if we leg it and run away or if we respond aggressively to a particular situation. So something like The Walking Dead, for example, by saying the amygdala is an important part in turning somebody into a zombie, are actually kind of skirting closely to the truth in that they're saying the amygdala is an important part in regulating our emotions, regulating our aggression, and even kind of things like our fear and our aversion to different things. We kind of see and mentioned The Last of Us, which is where a fungal spore gets into flour in the TV program. In the game, it's a bit different. And then that fungus is able to spread globally and again, very quickly start kind of causing these fungal zombie creatures to appear. Again, in reality, very, very unlikely to happen. Because in order for fungi to be able to infect humans, they need to often have some preconditions. And the classic precondition for fungi to be able to infect people is usually something like being immunocompromised. So we often find that one of the demographics who are most at risk of developing fungal infections or are patients with a compromised immune system, whereas individuals with a fully functional immune system tend to be quite resistant to fungal infection. And as I said earlier, that's why we don't tend to see fungal infections very, very commonly. Rabies, again, rabies will cause significant changes in behavior, can cause aggression, can cause paralysis. And again, in The Walking Dead, tends to be zombies come in one of two flavors, either the ones who will be actively kind of roaming around looking for people to eat, or the ones who are kind of laid out flat and not moving until somebody kind of comes too close to them. And again, we can see the influence of rabies on people like Kirkman, who wrote The Walking Dead, from that particular perspective. I say this slide, just to kind of finish on it, zombie fiction kind of tells us that everybody responds the same way. Undead kind of persist. That again is something that would be very, very challenging in a real life outbreak, because in most zombie fiction, the zombies have some form of magical protection that stops them from rotting away or starving to death. In real life, of course, if a person was infected by something that made them hyper aggressive, if they're not eating, if they're not drinking, if they're not looking after themselves, they would die. Again, if they're not kind of sound mind and they're kind of going out into a snowstorm wearing kind of just their boxer shorts, doesn't matter what the virus is doing to their brains, they'll still become hypothermic and become really, really unwell. So this notion of kind of the undead or the zombies persisting for the length of however long it's useful for the directors just isn't realistic in real life. So whilst we can all appreciate and enjoy zombie fiction, and I know I do, unfortunately, real biology at the moment doesn't really allow for that type of outbreak to occur. Whilst there are things, as we've been talking about in real life infections, that kind of match tiny little bits of the zombie narrative, there is no one pathogen at the moment which kind of ticks all the boxes that we would kind of expect from zombie literature. And again, I think, films like 28 Days Later, for example, I think they're very kind of clever in how they kind of try to get around this, in where they say the rage virus, which is what kind of drives the zombies in that particular film, is actually a man-made pathogen. So rather than being something that kind of exists in nature, it's actually something that has been produced. I can't remember what exactly it was, but I think kind of rabies was one part of it. And again, if you've seen the film, the original film, they have it they're growing it in primates, and then people break into the research center to release the primates, and of course that's what then condemns the world in that particular film. So again, not one infection meets all the requirements of a traditional zombie apocalypse, but there are examples in nature that come very, very close in some regards. So as we kind of draw to the end of this, and kind of before we go to the questions, just kind of 3 points to really kind of remember from this particular session is that in the real world, infections can alter behavior, sometimes dramatically. So the next time you are sick with a cold or the flu and you're feeling grumpy or not very hungry or just kind of no monad, as we say in this part of the world, that is because the infection or your body's response to that infection is literally changing your behavior. Some parasites genuinely manipulate host behavior. So again, things like cordyceps in ants and toxoplasma in mice and rodents. And kind of the last point I would like to kind of make at this point is that as interesting as zombie fiction is, real biology is much more interesting and much more complex. And again, the understanding we have of how these infections and many, many more are able to change how we behave is really, really only in its infancy. And we are starting to learn so much more about how these tiny, tiny things that are invisible to the naked eye can actually have such a profound change on our behavior. And I say, our behavior that we like to think of is quite fixed, that, you know, we are who we are and that won't change. How that isn't necessarily true. And I say these small, tiny organisms are able to cause some quite significant changes to our behavior that can sometimes then last for the rest of our lifetimes. So on that hopefully interesting note, diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. And does anybody have any questions?
Diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much. I've actually seen the zombie ants when I went over to Costa Rica, so bringing back memories there.
They're eerie, aren't they? And it's just the fact that something they can lose. I mean, not that ants have much autonomy anyway, but they just kind of lose everything, and yeah.
I was also reassured at the time that that could not happen to me, so it's very glad to hear that. And also lovely to meet George in the form of a picture in the presentation. I'm sure that went down very well, and always good to have a warning first though. Right, so moving on to the questions. If anybody's got any questions, please put them in the Q&A. We've only got one that's come in at the moment, so if you want to type your question whilst we answer this one, please do. Question is the human brain able to recover from the effects of infection on behaviour change? And that is if we survive, of course. And does that depend on the infection?
So the answer to that is yes, and it is very much kind of dependent on the infection. You know, with something like a flu, you might have some, you know, significant changes to your behavior, but those are mostly driven by your body's own response against the virus. So as soon as that virus is gone, your body will stop producing all those signals, and you will then go back to how you were before. With conditions or infections that directly actually infect the brain, however, they can cause some long-standing kind of personality changes, behavioral changes, because unfortunately, once the cells or tissue of the brain itself have become damaged or destroyed, it's very, very rare that they can be repaired. And it's quite morbid, but also quite interesting that one of the ways that we started kind of exploring what different parts of the brain do was actually by studying patients who, through infection or other disease, had damage to particular parts of their brain. So they might have, for example, damage in the frontal lobe, and as a result of that, they'd be taking, you know, they'd be a lot more aggressive, they'd be a lot less inhibited, and we'd go, oh, well, that's what that part of the brain does. So yeah, just to kind of go back to your question, it very much depends. If your behaviors are caused by inflammation, you go back to normal fairly quickly afterwards. But if the changes are caused by direct infection to your brain, they tend to be much more persistent.
Great deal, thank you. And I think I've got a question for myself. We've touched on lots of different, obviously there's lots of programs and films and things. Like you said, there's the usual tropes of the zombies. Which one do you think gets it closest to the truth?
So, interesting question. So I have to be honest, I'm fairly new to the whole kind of zombie thing, because I don't think there are any of my old classmates in this particular call. If there are, they're going to know exactly what I'm talking about. But I went to watch the remake of Dawn of the Dead far too young, and that ended up absolutely traumatizing me for years. So it's only, funnily enough, when COVID started, I kind of went, oh, let's start watching zombie things, because, you know, that's what we need in the middle of a global pandemic, isn't it? So I'm very, very new to them, because there's only kind of few bits and pieces that I've kind of watched. But I say, from the kind of ones who probably get it kind of closest, I'd say it probably is something like 28 Days Later, where they're not classical zombies. They're just somebody who've been infected with something that kind of changes their behavior. and as a result, aggressive, and they tend to, again, the whole premise of one film is that they will die of starvation after a while, so cheerful thought. But yeah, I think that's probably the one that's closest to reality, and not worth contemplating kind of if it were to happen. I say they can run. I wouldn't stand much of a chance if the zombies could run.
It's all down to the physicality, the survival of the human race in that circumstance. So it doesn't seem like we've got any more questions coming in, but thanks for the question that we did get. So just to say then, we hope that you enjoyed today's session. Gobeithio bo chi mwynhau heddiw 'ma. If you are interested in any of the North Wales Medical School courses, please take a look at our web pages, or you can come and join us on an open day. So we've got some coming up this summer, and the next one's taking place on Saturday, the 4th of July. So if you want to come along, you can book your place through our website.